We are not going to spend time on the apocalypse today.
No,
we're going to spend time on childhood, which is like, it's the opposite of the apocalypse. It's actually a hedge against apocalypse. That's what childhood is in some ways. And we're going to start. So this is, as regular listeners will know, we are going chapter by chapter through our book, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, which is coming out September 14th, 2021, and doing an excerpt or two from each of the successive chapters and then talking about it. And so I actually have a couple of excerpts for this week that I'm going to read, we're going to talk about, and then I have some other supporting information to share. So without further ado, we're going to start with just the first 3 pages of the childhood chapter. All of these chapters really go so many places. And so even if you feel like, oh, you're reading excerpts, I pretty much know what's in the book. No, every single chapter has a ton more than anything we're talking about. So chapter 9, childhood. Childhood is a time of exploration. It is a time to learn rules, to break rules, and to make new rules. When our older son Zach was 5 years old, he innovated a new mode of locomotion downstairs, which involved a large rubber ball and a mattress. It worked well, until it didn't. His arm brake required the surgical insertion of metal pins to stabilize the growth plate of his humerus, and another surgery 6 weeks later to remove them, but he healed beautifully and innovated with more wisdom going forward. A young orangutan, following his mother through the trees, may whimper and call for her upon reaching a gap that is too large for him to cross. She will return and bridge the gap, allowing him both to cross and to see how it is done. Young ravens spend years in large social groups after they become independent from their parents and before they form pair bonds with long-term partners. Alliances form during this time, but conflicts also arise, and those ravens that figure out how to reconcile with one another experience less aggression going forward. When a young snow monkey named Emo innovated cleaning her sweet potatoes by dipping them into the sea, the adults in her troop were slow to take notice. They lived together on a tiny islet in Japan, but only 2 adults in the troop copied her behavior over the next 5 years. The young monkeys, though, the other children and sub-adults, watched and learned. 5 years on, nearly 80% of the juvenile monkeys were cleaning their sweet potatoes in the style of Emo. During childhood, we learn how to be. We also learn who we are, and we dream about who we might become. Humans are not blank slates, but of all organisms on Earth, we are the blankest. We have the longest childhoods on Earth, and we arrive in the world with more plasticity than any other species, meaning that we are the least set in stone. Software, which is the interplay of experience and knowledge with capacity, is more important in humans than in any other species. A profound demonstration of this can be seen in the peopling of the Americas. A handful of ancestors came into the New World with Stone Age technology and diversified into hundreds of cultures across 2 continents, inventing writing, astronomy, architecture, and city-states along the way, the pace of change being far too rapid to be attributable to genes. It all took place on the software side. Our ability to learn language is part of our hardware. Nearly all human babies have this competence latent in them. Which language a baby will speak, however, is entirely context-dependent. That's software. Furthermore, we quickly lose some of our ability to hear and construct the phonemes and tones of languages that are not in our environment, regardless of our particular ethnicity or lineage. Just as we are born with more neuronal potential than we use, most of our neurons die off before we become adults, we are also born with more linguistic potential than we use, and some of it is lost during childhood. We are born with broad potential, and that potential narrows over time. On its surface, the paring down of initial capacity may seem like a tremendous waste, so why do we do it? The answer is that when we are born, we are in a mode of exploration. We cannot predict ahead of time precisely what neurons we will need, or what language we will speak, so we are born with a surplus of capacity. This permits us to optimize our minds to whatever world we find ourselves born into without the need for prior knowledge. We are born to explore the world around us, discover its secrets, and structure our minds accordingly. Once this job is done, we shed our surplus capacity, lest it become a metabolic liability, all cost, and no reward. Humans are social, with long lifespans, and have overlap between generations. Grandparents, parents, and children may all live in the same place at the same time. These characteristics also apply to the other apes, to the toothed whales, dolphins and orcas, and to elephants, to parrots and corvids, crows and jays, wolves and lions, and more. All species that are social, are long-lived, and have generational overlap also tend to have long childhoods. These other species' childhoods come with tantrums and play, emotional depth and cognitive capacity just like ours. The adults that develop from those children of other species have social complexity that is recognizable to us humans as well. Spinner dolphins choreograph elaborate group hunts. New Caledonian crows share information among their friends. Elephants grieve. Spending time as children allows animals to learn about their environment, therefore stealing childhood from the young by organizing and scheduling their play for them, by keeping them from risk and exploration, by controlling and sedating them with screens and algorithms and legal drugs, practically guarantees that they will arrive at the age of adulthood without being capable of actually being adults. All of these actions, almost always well-intentioned, prevent the human software from refining our crude and rudimentary hardware. Absent childhood, animals must rely more fully on hardware and therefore be less flexible. Among migratory bird species, those that are born knowing how, when, and where to migrate, those that are migrating entirely with instructions they were born with, sometimes have wildly inefficient migration routes. These birds, born knowing how to migrate, don't adapt easily. So when lakes dry up, forest becomes farmland, or climate change pushes breeding grounds farther north, those birds that are born knowing how to migrate keep flying by the old rules and maps. By comparison, birds with the longest childhoods and those that migrate with their parents tend to have the most efficient migration routes. Childhood facilitates the passing on of cultural information, and culture can evolve faster than genes. Childhood gives us flexibility in a changing world.
Hell yeah. So much important there that can give you insight into how the world works, why it looks the way it does, and how you might live better if you know how to extrapolate from it, which we do in that chapter. It leads me to a couple of thoughts. One, I'm very interested to see whether the world will figure out the blankest slate point. Mm-hmm. Right. So just to reiterate, we aren't blankists. We are not blank slates, but we are the blankest of all life on Earth. Right.
We are born with the most capacity to become something we are not yet.
And so this puzzle, there's a couple layers to this puzzle. One, people will have heard us talk many times about the fact that sex is in fact binary, whether we like it or not. Mm-hmm. Right. It just simply is. So in this case, binary thinking is actually where you want to start. Now, there's lots of nuance.
In the case of sexual reproduction. In the case of sex,
mm-hmm. Right? And then you could say, actually, the software, which is gender, is much more variable, but the sex isn't, right? So mm-hmm. there's a binary aspect. There's a more continual aspect that's heavily bimodal, but not perfectly so. Or it is bimodal, but it is there's at least stuff from one end of the continuum to the other.
That's right.
But anyway, the point is, we tend to be binary in our thinking reflexively. And that has not served us well with respect to the so-called nature-nurture debate, the blank slatism, which is preposterous, the rebellion against blank slatism, which is preposterous, right? Both of these things are wrong. And so how do you even formulate this? And just the simple recognition, just the fact that human beings are just the blankest slate by virtue of the fact that the amount of our behavioral repertoire that has been offloaded to a flexible portion of the mind that is actually loaded in after we are born is greater than in any other creature. That's an amazing fact, and understanding its implication, right, and where that puts us in this non-binary discussion is crucial. So, I don't know whether the book will have this effect on the discussion, mm-hmm. but understanding that you are not being clever to say we are not blank slates, right? If you do not follow it up with, given that is one end of a continuum and we are closer to it than anything else, then what are we to infer?
Right, exactly. And it's not to suggest that we have any less genetic input at an absolute level than our brethren and than everything else on the planet, but that we have so much more that contributes to us becoming what we are. That at the absolute level we are genetic in makeup, just as chimps are, just as chanterelle mushrooms are, just as cedars are, just as giraffes are. But we have, in addition, as and as with so many of these things, and we talk about this in the book a lot, we've got this sort of nested sets of actually all mammals have a fair bit of learning to do. And some mammals don't do very much, but because of that, initial innovation of milk, of mother's milk, which then allows for the evolution of love and allows for the transmission not just of, nutrients and immunological information through the actual milk, but the tactile bonding, and then just the spending time together that then allows for the further evolution of more time that is spent in childhood. All mammals have some kind of juvenile phase that could be called childhood, but there are, the usual suspects, as I call them, those organisms that are long-lived and social with generational overlap. As we say in this excerpt I just read, almost always also tend to have long childhoods, and childhood being that period between birth and it varies. Over in non-human animal space, we tend to say age of first reproduction. But of course, there's a tremendous amount of time, which in humans we call sort of puberty or adolescence, after which you are technically capable of reproducing, but before which you can really be considered a full adult. And so all of that is what we're considering in this concept of childhood, during which time different cultures have different timings, and actually that's the next excerpt that I'll read, and maybe that's a good segue. But just as all mammals throughout history have provided milk to their young, all humans throughout history have a period of time during which the children are at first completely helpless, and then somewhat less helpless, and then ever more able to help themselves, but at the same time benefiting from being in the family setting, being able to observe what elders do, what youngers do, to teach, to learn, to interact, to play. All of these things are not an after effect. They aren't sort of what you do, and we'll get to this too. They aren't what you do to fill time because you're stuck in childhood. They are the reason for childhood.
They are the reason for childhood. And we should say, it's very easy to jump too early to a conclusion, right? Mm-hmm. So we have more that is divorced from the genes. I didn't mean that. I'm just waiting for my phone to pick up on the word divorced and send me more ads. But
genes? What?
No, yeah. The fact that the genes have surrendered control over our behavioral repertoire is not an indication that the other part of us has staged a coup. And that's another key feature of the book, is that we describe the relationship between the software and the hardware. And the point is they actually agree on the hardware's objectives for both better and worse, mm-hmm. right? It makes understanding what we are much simpler. But the point is the genes have offloaded the work to the software layer because it is done better and faster, mm-hmm. not because they have given up any control, or they've given up proximate control, but they haven't given up control over ultimate objectives. And that is, in many ways, the greatest obstacle that we face, is that we have this sort of default inherited purpose, which is the same as the purpose of every other creature, and therefore not a worthy purpose for creatures like us who have values that are not best matched to that most fundamental evolutionary objective. So anyway, we have to grapple with that. And I guess the third thing, which you hinted at in passing here, is that childhood, as much as it is an amazing time, is actually an unavoidable cost. In order to get the software part loaded well, you have to have a childhood. It's a cost that you have to endure. And mm-hmm. if you think about the way selection has to view this, childhood is a big risk, right? It's because childhood is long and dangers are many. There's every possibility to invest in someone and have them never reach a reproductive capacity. So it's a cost that is borne because it must be borne in order to get the benefits of it, which are this amazing flexibility, right? Yeah. The difference between being stuck with a migratory route or being able to change your migratory route to be more efficient.
Yeah. And I love that result. I remember when I first came across that about the migratory birds, that are born knowing where to go, and those that are learning it from their parents on the fly, quite literally. I used to share that in my vertebrate evolution programs when I taught that, and I've seen no update, but it also stands. It hasn't been falsified. This idea that even for birds traveling long distances, if you have someone with whom you can do an interplay in real time, go like, oh, this or that, as opposed to I know what to do and I'm doing it. How would you learn under those conditions? It's got to be a very, very drastic change for a migratory bird who's born knowing, is born with the instructions on board for where to go and how to get there, to change that up.
Right. It's the very clumsy process that we describe in the Bio 101 textbook rather than the upgraded process that selection has discovered that allows for the rapid honing in on a new innovative way of doing something better.
Well, and don't get us started on textbooks, right? Like in this as in so many things, what's in the textbook is hopefully was generally thought to be right at the point that it was written. It never describes the actual process by which we arrive at what we think to be true. That is, it doesn't describe the actual scientific process. It may describe the conclusions of the scientific process. And it tends to simplify to the point of caricature, which often then ends up introducing inaccuracy, usually unintentional, but so often textbook versions of things, as opposed to deep dives and discussions about what the implications are, will lead you astray. And this is why this is sort of the basis for this thing that people say, a little knowledge can be a bad thing, right? You know a little bit and you think you know what evolution is, you think you know what science is, and then you speak with the authority from a textbook as opposed to the authority of having dug deep and tried to think through what would this mean? What are the implications? If A, B, and C, then what? What will follow? And that, of course, is a large part of what we're trying to do here on Evolutionary Lens.
I mean, I've changed my opinion a little bit on what's going on in the textbooks. I mean, textbooks themselves are a troubling phenomenon.
And let me just say, school is next week, so we'll come back here.
We'll get there.
Yeah.
But if you think about just the process of science and textbooks as sort of an instantaneous description of the model as it stands, right? They're not perfect. They're written so as to be understood. They're not necessarily the top quality thinking. They should lean in that direction as often as possible. But if you think about science as a process that builds models that predict behavior of stuff, and those models, as they get closer and closer to the truth, predict better and better, right? The number of factors that they exclude drops. The textbook, in theory, should grow, and its ability to predict what takes place in any particular instance should go up. But at some level, this is not so different from the much more normal process of understanding the world around you, whether it be the social world or whether it be the sport that you play or whatever. You have some model, something you say that isn't exactly true, right? And so in the book, we talk about literally false, metaphorically true things, but the degree to which that applies to every realm, right? In sport, for example, the idea that you have to follow through, right, on your swing at the baseball, right? You're not affecting the baseball after it has left the bat. Following through is not what works. It's the planning to follow through that causes you to hit the baseball properly, and then everything after that is just what happens, right? So does that matter? No. The best way to teach somebody to hit the baseball properly is to tell them to follow through, right?
Yeah, I remember this. I played more tennis than baseball as a kid, even before this foot surgery that I had. And I remember in a stubborn moment, which I had a few of, going like, what if I don't? What if I don't follow through? And I could just tell. I could just tell as a kid, there's no way. I understand the physics well enough. I have scientifically informed people in my life. And even though I'm a kid, I know that this can't matter. But I couldn't, if I knew I wasn't following through, I could not play as effective tennis as if I didn't think it. And part of it is that you can reach that sort of flow state more easily if you aren't trying to stop the thing as soon as you leave, as soon as the ball leaves the racket. Right.
That's part of it, but it's also that there's in order to stop the racket afterwards, you have to invest in the stopping of it. And that gets in the road of the thing that you're doing. So imagining that follow through actually matters. It does matter, but it doesn't matter for the advertised reason. Right. Obviously, anybody who plays one of these things can figure that out. But the point is, no, it's still the best way to teach it. And how do you figure out what's going to happen on a billiard table? right? Well, Newtonian mechanics is wrong, but it's not so wrong that we don't still teach it because it's still really freaking useful at slow speeds, right? So anyway, these are models. They contain a degree.
So just to fill that out, you don't teach Einstein to people learning pool,
right?
It does. That would be pointless,
right? It would be pointless, right? If you're trying to understand what's going to happen, the added value of doing it the more rigorous way is not matched by the added complication of it, and so you have this approximate model that works really well.